This is, as Katie said at the introduction, a cybersecurity presentation about moving beyond compliance. So we've got a number of slides that I'd like to take you through. First of all, very briefly about Reliance. We are an organisation which helps other organisations defend against their advanced cybersecurity threats. So we do that essentially through two main channels. We do that through a managed service. So we have an advanced SOC with XDR services, and we also have managed security services, again, as part of that managed services business. And we also have professional services within Reliance, and that includes things like threat intelligence, vulnerability management, governance, risk and compliance, and incident response as well. So I lead up our governance, risk and compliance practice within Reliance. So that's a little bit about us, but probably enough. So what I want to talk to you today is about compliance and just trying to explain that there are new ways and better ways that we can go about the management of our cyber risk and move from maybe away from some of those legacy issues, which we've suddenly had to start doing. And in fact, the previous speaker as well spoke a couple of times about the increase in regulation. So in order to actually put this into context, there's been a number of real systemic shocks across society over the past 20, 30 years. So, I've got, we start in the top left-hand corner here with sort of Sterling leaving the ERM, first of all, in 1992. Then we've had some other systemic shocks, things like the Enron and WorldCom fraud in 96, LTCM, so long-term capital management, a hedge fund in the US, suddenly collapsed in 98, which led to nearly $4 billion of US dollars from the Treasury and other banks to bail them out. I'm sure you'll remember the subprime housing collapse in 2008, when some large organizations, Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, went out of business, and also how it impacted our own in the UK financial services like Northern Rock and HBOS. Other systemic shocks that we've encountered include things like the Leveson inquiry and the trust that we've traditionally placed in traditional newspapers. And finally, I've got some UK audit failures, some key ones there. So again, in the past 5 years, we've had issues with Patisserie Valerie, with Carillion, with Rolls-Royce, major organizations, in our consciousness, which have all suddenly started to fail. So as a result of these systemic shocks, what's happened is that it's actually driving certain behaviors. So as a result, you're seeing governments getting more and more involved. We're seeing an increase in legislation that is feeding through into regulation, and then that's driving compliance. So just going back to just 4 examples of those systemic shocks I mentioned. So the Enron and WorldCom issues led to the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, and I'm sure anyone who deals with the US is well aware of that one. When it came to the subprime housing collapse and what's happened in the UK, we saw the FSA, the Financial Services Authority, being replaced by the PRA, the Prudential Regulation Authority, and the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority. So again, a big shake-up in UK financial services. When it comes to the Leveson inquiry and what came off the back of that, essentially there's a sword of Damocles now hanging over the Prem, and as a result of that, they are very much, say, following self-governance, but there's always that threat there that regulation, it will be coming down from government. And finally, when it came to those issues around the audit failures, we now have the creation of ARGA, the Audit Reporting and Governance Authority, that will sit alongside the Financial Reporting Council. So I say a number of these large systemic shocks which have shocked the population. It's the sort of issue that makes the 9 o'clock news or the 10 o'clock news, and government is responding as a result. The issue is, very often organizations are now being forced down a particular route. And what we talk about here is, it's often compliance is front and center to what organizations are now having to address. So in order to differentiate what compliance is as opposed to risk management, and in particular cyber risk management, we'll just start off with a couple of definitions. So compliance means meeting a baseline set of requirements or standards, and it applies those same requirements to all organizations within a particular sector. So it doesn't really take into account the size of an organization, the type of business assets that it might be handling, some of the other sort of internal controls, but it, I say, applies those same requirements right the way across the board. Those requirements are actually updated infrequently. Legislation, once it's passed, does tend to stay on the statute books for many, many years. I'm sure you all remember the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which was rolled out in 2018. I mean, that was an update of the old Data Protection Act, which has essentially been on the statute books for over 20 years. And also, compliance means it's that the controls that are in place, that are required, is a point in time. It doesn't necessarily evolve. It can often then lead to a bit of a tick box exercise. So how do we compare that to what we mean by risk management and cyber risk management? Well, the whole purpose of that is that it aims to protect customer data in particular, maintain your assets, and maintain your business reputation. Instead of just applying a broad set of controls, it applies these controls to the people aspects, to technology, and also some of the processes that you're going to have as part of your organizations, both enterprise and small, medium scale organizations. It also should respond continuously to evolving threats, and if possible, get ahead of that. So I mentioned things like threat intelligence. So especially in the cyber world, where the threat landscape is constantly changing, where threat actors are constantly changing their methods in order to try and exploit organizations. The idea behind cyber risk management is that you're constantly evolving to those threats and putting in place new controls in order to stop them actually becoming successful and impacting your business. It should be viewed as a strategic component of enterprise risk management. So enterprise risk management has pretty much evolved over the past 60, 70 years, maybe even longer, and takes into account a whole load of different aspects. Cyber, being still a relatively new discipline, should still now be incorporated within that and not treated as a separate component, and certainly not just as a component of IT. One of the things that I've always believed is that cyber and information security is very much part of a business issue and an enterprise risk management issue, and not just purely an IT one. And finally, we tie this directly to business goals and outcomes. So again, making sure that any standard that you might have to follow or compliance, if you do have to go down that route, is still aligned very much with the business goals and outcomes, and that you're not wasting money. So in fact, this is in many ways, this is an opportunity to help improve efficiency of a business and make sure that your controls are aligned to your business goals and your business outcomes. So I say for us, having a bit more of a risk management approach as opposed to a compliance approach does help, and it is a better way for organizations. It gives you an idea of where you focus your resources of time and money. It is part of your integral business strategy, and it does require a little bit of a shift in mindset. As I mentioned, we're not just talking about complying to a particular international standard or national standard. It's actually looking at the organization, what its goals and outcomes are, and making sure that you're a bit more proactive as opposed to doing that tick box exercise. So for us, all organizations should start to include cyber risk within their enterprise risk management program. And what do we mean by that? Well, it means that there is a clear relationship between cybersecurity and organizational objectives, and that's considered right the way throughout the organization. And also top management monitor cybersecurity risk in the same context as financial risk and other organizational risks. So what we're talking about here is things like board level and executive management having a clear understanding of what cybersecurity is, risk is. Obviously, they're not going to be personally accountable for all of it, but certainly taking that board level view of where the key risks are in the organization and treating that in the same way as financial risk. Strategic cybersecurity risk management also means that organizations can decide how they handle its risk, depending on the impact to the delivery of critical services. So what we mean here is that, again, rather than just applying a broad standard or doing a compliance-based approach, what you're doing is you're looking at your key assets, you're looking at your key data, and you're actually applying the right levels of controls to those. You're not just applying a broad brush approach, which again, could be costly. Following on, as I say, it's costly because having a clearer view of your cyber risk management means that businesses can make more informed decisions about that expenditure. It does help organizations to do a lot more future planning. And as the purse strings have been eased a little bit over the past 4 or 5 years, you're making sure that when you do start to invest in your cybersecurity strategy, it's in the right places, and you can justify that accordingly. And it also means that being proactive with your cyber improves the way that companies can either avoid or manage existing and emergent risks, and provides the tools necessary to quickly adapt to a crisis. I mentioned one of the things we do is around incident response and also crisis simulation, and we feel that being able to respond quickly and confidently to an incident is going to help a business perform more effectively. It gives them greater resilience and is, again, a far better approach than purely just taking a compliance-based tick box. So the final thing I just wanted to talk through today are 6 key takeaways. So if you are starting to consider your cybersecurity strategy, and you're probably not surprised to know that many enterprise scale organizations are still very much considering cyber and getting to grips with it and understanding what it means for their business. These 6 key takeaways should help you to start putting in place some of the foundations for your own cybersecurity risk management strategy. So the first one is to actually focus, I say, on what cyber is going to mean for yourself. So it's looking at your risk management frameworks, developing a formal guide, looking at some of the security best practices out there. And there are a lot of very good and often some free information and resources out there. So you don't necessarily have to go off and start paying for expensive training courses or expensive international standards. Again, there are a lot of good practices out there that a lot of institutions will put out for free. And also the final point on this one here is to allocate a board sponsor to ensure that you do get that highest level of buy-in. And that board sponsor should be someone with enough power to help influence and make things happen. Again, making sure that if you do have a chief information security officer, the CISO, that they are indeed do have that board level impact, and they do report on the same level as the other C-suite, where it's the CFO, CIO, CTO. The second thing that you should start to consider is to look at your vulnerabilities and start to strengthen them. That means doing a proper assessment of your technology landscape, but also some of your people aspects as well, identifying the paths of least resistance. Again, the previous speaker mentioned that human error was often responsible for a great many of the outages that would occur. So again, looking at how well trained some of your staff are, and often they could well be that weakest link in an organization, and start to strengthen them. Start continuous risk awareness. So again, that's standing up a program of constantly looking at maybe your technical landscape and having a vulnerability management program in place for that, but also testing your staff. So I'm sure some of you have seen a lot of phishing emails out there, and also organizations, how they test their own internal capabilities to identify phishing emails and report them accordingly. Developing disaster recovery and business continuity plans. So we feel that no organisation is ever going to be completely excluded from any type of attack. So please expect the unexpected. As a result, this means that having disaster recovery and business continuity plans in place are absolutely essential for any organisation. That also means that backups, recovery systems, alerting tools, and everything else is proactive and remain proactive, and that you do test, and test. So again, taking a compliance approach, very often you might see an organisation restore from backup maybe once, but we don't feel, again, that's particularly effective. It's being far more proactive, doing regular test backup restores. It's also testing in a desktop environment what your both operational teams and also some of your executive management teams, how they would react in the event of an incident, and going through that refinement process. The fourth key takeaway is to automate processes and alerts as much as you can. Manual security does require a lot of resources. So if you're reviewing manually on a daily basis, your audit logs, your alerts, things like that, that can take up an awful lot of bandwidth. And very often you could well miss some of the more carefully crafted attacks that the threat actors will launch on an organization. So again, we're encouraging organizations to look at various tooling out there, look at some automated tools, which is going to help you prioritize practices. And it does provide, again, quicker response time when an incident does arise. And again, organizations are going to be better informed as a result of that. The fifth point that we try to emphasize for organizations is to establish a VRA framework, so a vendor risk assessment framework. Each endpoint and network connection, say, represents a potential vulnerability. And you will have an awful lot of suppliers and vendors into the organization. Your own boundary has no doubt extended well beyond your four walls. And as a result of that, you need to be sure, you need to be aware of where all the potential ingress points are to that organization. So again, we encourage organizations to start to triage their suppliers, ensure those who do present the biggest risk from a resilience and compliance perspective are assessed. So I mentioned very briefly about your own boundaries, how that has extended. And this is just a typical example here of an organization of how the old way of looking at things, where everything was pretty much controlled within an organization, has changed dramatically as technology has changed as well. The use of software as a service in particular has really extended the boundaries. And the last slide for today is to communicate often. Communicate with your stakeholders. That means both up and down, so communicating to your boards, to the executive management, as well as maybe an external board and potentially shareholders, but also communicate inside the organization. Tell your employees what you're doing, make them aware of where you're going, help bring them along on that training and education path with them. Be transparent about your security policies, both internally and also, as I mentioned in the last slide, with your third parties. So if you are starting to extend your boundaries and you're sharing further information with third parties, make sure you're clear about what you expect those third parties to do with your data and how you expect them to go about protecting that. And knowledge sharing underpins all data security best practices. So attending forums like this, also joining up to industry events around information and cybersecurity just helps to, as I say, get better also as organizations. There is a lot, as I said right at the beginning, there is a lot of very good information out there, a lot of good resources. So I do encourage you to look at what organizations such as NIST, the US NIST, the National Institute of the Standards and Technology are doing around the space of information and cybersecurity. So I say that was a whistle-stop tour. Originally, talked about the difference there between compliance and cybersecurity risk management and how we feel this is a better way of doing it. And those 6 key takeaways I hope are useful for all of you. So thank you very much. I'll put my email in the chat if anyone wants to get in contact with me. But otherwise, I'll stop there, Kaylee, and hand back to you.
Thank you so much, Paul. Just a quick question, if you're able to answer it quickly before we move to the panel. Just really a quick question about cybersecurity democratization, and whether you think sort of that's going to be the way forward, because people are becoming more savvy about, you know, on the end user end, about what they need to look out for, but also potential, you know, cybercrime actors are aware that, you know, people are becoming more savvy to cyber threats. So what's your take on that?
I think in terms of democratization, I think you're quite right. We've seen an acceleration of that, obviously, since the pandemic. More and more people working remotely, working from home. As organizations don't have that same level of control that they previously had. And even when you see sort of top-level government organisations working at secret and top secret, how they're actually sort of trusting some of their individuals and their employees to not have to be in the office all the time and be able to work remotely. I think that's an indication of how trends are going. As a result of that, you're now seeing new practices in place. So I'm sure a lot of you have started to come across this term zero trust. So the way that organizations are now having to approach the democratization. So yeah, making sure that there is a change in mindset when it comes to ensuring that only the right people have got access to the right information at the right time. So as a response to, say, that increase in people working remotely, increasing number of people connected online all the time, industry has responded accordingly. So yeah, have a look at some of those zero trust principles. As regards the threat actors, it's a constantly fascinating and evolving space to watch as individuals and as organizations start to get a bit more cyber savvy and try to inform their workforce. The criminals are responding accordingly. So you'll see various changes in the way that they're crafting their own attacks, in particular things around sort of phishing. If you look at how that has evolved over the past 10 years, they are getting increasingly better, but it's still very much, we are humans, we're very busy, we lead very busy lives. Often it feels we're even busier in a post-pandemic world. As a result of that, criminals are still exploiting human vulnerabilities. So yeah, it's not entirely ever going to get solved.
Okay, thanks so much, Paul. Again, thank you for your session, and also for being able to move your schedule around and step into the earlier session. We really appreciate that. That was wonderful. Thanks very much for joining us today.